So, as we're coming to the end of our year together with Bible study, it's appropriate. We actually finally hit the ending of the Bible. We got the Chronicles. Chronicles are the last two books in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible. From an authorship point, they are written very late. Probably not as late as Daniel, but they are written pretty late. It's likely written in sort of late 5th century BCE, after the return from exile. We were studying last time around Ezra and Nehemiah, those two books, which were also written fairly late, probably maybe later than these. As they are reestablishing temple worship and basically creating and firming up, so to speak, what is going to become the Torah, right? The 5 books of Moses. Because eventually you have to say, this is in or this is out, and so they have to be able to edit and redact and sort of create what the Torah is going to be. So it's right around this same time where that is happening. In terms of who the author is, we have no idea who wrote this stuff down. There's no attribution of authorship. It was likely written by either someone who was a priest or someone who is intimately involved with temple worship and sacrifices, because there are a lot of details and a lot of just sort of like lists about, who does what and how. And so it reads as a how-to guide in some sections. The first 9 books the first 9 chapters of Chronicles is genealogy. Thousands of years worth of genealogy. It starts with, this is Adam, like literally like Adam from the Garden of Eden, Adam. And it goes through the generations, and it is just a long list of names forever and ever and ever until your eyes roll back into their head, because it's too much. It's people that you never heard of in their lives, and their 28 different children. Like that's what this is. Genealogy, of course, does play a role. Why is genealogy important?
Because of the line of David and the Messiah and all of that.
Line of David, sort of very important, certainly.
Mashiach.
That's part of this, right? Mashiach. Important to know where you came from, right? And that's like part of the history. Who we are, how do we get here? Who are the people that were important to us on our journey, right? And so they literally list everybody they can think of. Some of these names you cannot even cross-reference because they aren't in the other parts of the Bible, right? They're just sort of here as names. And so how much of this is true to life, how much of this is made up, who knows? My impression would be is that the author has a tradition, right, of these names. And these were meaningful and important for this person to write down, right? These names, to the best of their knowledge. This is our history. This is where we came from the time of Adam, from the time in the Garden of Eden until today. But we have like birth stories and narratives of people I've never heard of, taking up, a chapter and a half. I mean, it's really intense. The main focus of the book relates to. Whoa. Get some feedback there. If everyone could just mute, that would be great. Thank you. So it starts with when we get to chapter 10, where the book sort of begins to take off. It starts with Saul's death and the ascension of King David, where the first book of Chronicles is really about King David and about his rise to power and how he consolidates power, how he creates the state of the country, better said, the country of Israel, how that comes to be under David's hand. If you remember from way back earlier in the year, probably 9-10 months ago, no more, sorry, last year proper, before COVID hit, actually, we read the books of Kings 1 and 2. We read some selections in the book of Kings, which was also a chronicle, so to speak, of the different kings, what they did, what they didn't do, etc., etc. Chronicles is like a rehash of those books. So the question is, why do you need both? if you have the history already in the books of Kings, why do you need Chronicles? Because it seems like a rehash, like a repeat. The answer seems to be that books of Chronicles are really about King David and his line, and letting us know, as Sandy had sort of mentioned before, that this line is important. This is the messianic line, and it is awesome. It is fantastic. So in the book of Kings, we have some stories about King David that aren't quite lovely. A little bit of adultery here, a little bit of murder there, a little bit of palace intrigue. There's a lot of stuff going on with his children. There's a lot in Kings that paints David as a pretty tricky historical figure. King of Israel, good dude. Also not such a good dude at points. Very problematic character. All of that stuff is gone from Chronicles. None of it's there. It's a much cleaner version of the Davidic history, of his line in particular, and of he himself. So it focuses on the idea of, well, he created the temple again, not the temple itself, but he reinstituted worship and sacrifices. He put everything in order. He becomes almost like a priest himself, not literally, but in terms of how he's portrayed, that he is now a model, exemplary establishment figure, a completely virtuous dude, a role model, right? For us all to buy into. So I think Chronicles, the reason why it's there is an uplift, right, to the Davidic legacy. This is why King David is important. This is why the Davidic line is important. They are awesome, fantastic kings, the bunch of them. And those other northern kings of Israel, PU, they're terrible. But it's the Davidic line that's the important one. The irony here, I would argue, is that in a way, Chronicles goes against the Bible in terms of its way of viewing history, because if we think about the Bible, right, all of our characters, sort of all of our ancestors, all of the people in the Bible, they're all morally complex. Like Abraham is a model, right, of divine service, of faith, of loyalty, and he tried to kill his kid, on Mount Moriah, right? And his marriage with Sarah wasn't always the best in terms of models of husband-wife relationships. Jacob, becomes Israel, and Jacob becomes, again, another sort of leader of our people, someone we look upon with praise. And he was a bit of a jerk, that's, his upbringing, right? He's not the nicest guy. And Joseph, how much the more so? The Bible has, even Moses, has his moments, right? We don't put angel wings and halos and everybody in the Torah, right? In the Bible, we recognize that they're people, and that people have flaws. Even the greatest of them are flawed characters, and it's that complexity, in a way that makes the Bible compelling, as opposed to Chronicles, which wants to whitewash the history and say David was just fantastic. He was the best thing since sliced challah. Like he was just the best thing. And so it almost takes away, by removing like the moral ambiguities, by removing some of that stuff. I think that it actually lessens maybe some of the intrigue that we have for somebody like a King David. With that said, it is, I think, a fascinating book. But and the reason, again, for its creation is it wanted to, I think, create a very straightforward, neat, practical, unambiguous narrative that the Davidic line, that's the line. That's the right way to go. That everything else, not so much. King David and his line, thumbs up. That's what we want to see more of. We should all emulate and be like King David. So with all that said, we're going to dive into this book a little bit. As I said, not a short book, but we're going to skip over some of the stuff that is just not really readable. But I did want to just give you an example. This is how the book starts out, right? And so Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah. I mean, this is just the names just keep going and going and going. And we see some people we remember, right? Like there's Noah. We remember Noah, right? I don't know if we remember Gomer so much, but we remember Noah. And it's just these names just keep going and going and going. Ham, it's Noah's son. Is Ham. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Those are his three kids. Um, and it just keeps going. And eventually we get to Abraham, right? And so there's Terach, and Terach's father, Nahor. We go back one more to Serug. And so eventually we have Abraham, and Abraham gets a line. That's all he gets. Like Abraham doesn't get they're not giving you the narrative, right? They're not giving you the stories of their lives. They're just giving you the names. So we have Avram, who becomes Avraham. And then we're done with him. We're moving on to Isaac and Ishmael and their progeny. And then we're going to jump forward a few hundred years. Here's Israel, right? Jacob. Here are his sons. Here are our tribes. Except we're missing a couple. But Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Joseph, Benjamin, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The Joseph gets split up into two tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. Because he's not a tribe, but his kids are. But these are the sons. And then here are the sons of Judah. They give you all his sons. You get a little bit of narrative here that Judah's son, was displeasing to the Eternal, and God took his life. That's the Judah and Tamar story, right? Where Judah's sons do what's wrong in the eyes of God. But then we get Tamar, his daughter-in-law, who then has relations with him and bears him these children too. And so then we have Judah's sons, etc., etc. Fast forward. David. Okay, now we got to David at least. These are the sons of David. And David, by the way, David took very literally be fruitful and multiply. David was not a fan of restraint. David has lots of kids. We get first when he was in Hebron, when he wasn't even king yet, he has Amnon, and by this woman over here, that was his wife at that point. We get Daniel by Abigail, another one of his wives. Then Absalom, son of Makkah, the fourth son, the fifth son, the sixth son. And then later on, he has more kids in Jerusalem. He has more children, because eventually you finally get to Solomon. After like 10 kids, we get to Solomon, who's going to be important by Bathshua, who's going to be Bathsheba, depending on which translation you're looking at. And then, some more kids, another 9. All of them David's sons, besides the sons of the concubines, even more sons with the concubines. So, and we actually do get a girl. Tamar was their sister. And so we do have one girl. He had lots of boys.
He was a busy man.
A busy man, and Solomon was going to take after his old man, certainly, right? And so Solomon was going to be just as busy, so to speak. And here comes Solomon, right? And these are all of his kids. And then these are Josiah's kids. And so it just keeps going and going and going with these names, trying to give us a sense of the history. Once they do that, once they give us a sense of all the history and all the different names, then we can almost go back in time a little bit and actually tell the story and flesh it out a little bit more with the beginnings of the Davidic dynasty. We know all about all the people, so to speak, but now we have to know a little bit of the history, a little bit of the story. And so at chapter 10, it really does pick up with the end of Saul and the beginning of King David. So that's where we should really formally begin today. Sandy, if you want to unmute, you can pick up the Philistines attacked Israel.
The Philistines attacked Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines, and many fell on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines pursued Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, sons of Saul. The battle raged around Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was wounded by the archers.
Okay, and so this is sort of like Saul's last stand here. that he is fighting this battle against the Israelites, long rival. The Philistines are always sort of battling each other, during this time period. Um, and eventually they get him. Now we remember from perhaps other stories, David and Jonathan. Jonathan as Saul's son, and David having a very nice relationship with Jonathan. Some have extrapolated perhaps the nature of that relationship being a little bit more than friendship. But so David and Jonathan are very closely connected to each other. But here Jonathan dies along with the other sons, and Saul gets hit as well by an arrow. And so this is really the end of the house of Saul because his sons die here, and he is mortally wounded in this battle. And so, Sandy, you want to give me a little bit more? Saul said.
Sure. Saul said to his arms bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, so that these uncircumcised may not come and make sport of me." But his arms bearer, out of great awe, refused. Whereupon Saul grasped the sword and fell upon it. When the arms bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died. Thus Saul and his 3 sons and his entire house died together.
There we go. Yeah, and so Saul sees that he is not going to make it, and he wants the arms bearer, who accompanies him, to end it for him, but he can't. He can't kill his king. He can't do that, and so Saul takes it into his own hands, quite literally, and the arms bearer does the same thing, and that's again the end of the house of Saul, which cleans it up for David, right next, right? Because now there's going to be no question of succession because Saul and his family have passed on in this battle.
Rabbi,
Bob, yeah, sorry.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
In our tradition, or this part of the tradition, do any of the people that we sort of are, the men in particular, the women, do they have any, I don't know what the word would be, but like insights or predictions or something internal that they knew that they were to do something special? I'm kind of comparing it to kind of Christianity in a way that some of the, at least from what my limited knowledge, had a sense that this was something that almost was had to be in order for it to play out. Is there any of that in our part of the Bible?
I would say that there are allusions. I mean, not even allusions, but I mean, pretty frontally, obviously, people getting chosen, right, for missions. I don't think they have the sense in the same way of like, this is how it's meant to be, especially when it comes to their ends, when it comes to the end of the road. It's a good question. I mean,
I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think about the different figures. Like, obviously, I would say that they all had, at least the big ones that we could think about. Like Abraham, let's use Abraham. Like Abraham had a sense of mission, right? Abraham's
Right.
first direction is mission. It's Lech Lecha, get out of your land, go to the land that I will show you, and you'll be a great nation. So Abraham had a sense of purpose, right, and a sense of destiny. That he was meant to do this great thing. For sure. Moses, from the burning bush, right, has a sense of purpose, and that he'll be the one to lead the people. If we're thinking about like sort of tragic end, I don't think we have that as much, of like someone dies, like it was meant to be this way. It was preordained that, I would give my life. I regret I only have one life to give to Israel, kind of thing. We don't have that in the same way. I think later in some of the rabbinic stories, we get that a little bit more than in the Bible.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
This was curious. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, for Saul in particular, and we'll touch upon it in a minute, but the idea for Saul, at least, was that he did know, right, that he wasn't going to have a happy end. I would say. I think he tried to outrun it in a way, but I think Saul did know maybe it wasn't going to have the best end because of his own actions. That's what I think is the caveat, right? Is that like the Israelites, in the books of the prophets, right? Like that they are sort of forewarned, and the prophets sort of know that this isn't going to end well, and it's the prophet's job to basically tell them, hey, you're all screwing this up, and it's going to be a problem because God's going to come down, and there's going to be some chastisement, to put it mildly. And Saul, because of his actions, was warned, right, that it wasn't going to end well for him. How much he believed it, right, I don't know. Like how much he understood that was going to be the case. But Saul was definitely sort of warned, one too many screw ups, that this was no longer going to be his job. That he was going to be repurposed and reassigned, so to speak, and that David was going to be the one to lead. And David has a sense of purpose, right? Too. I mean, obviously, and that gets a little bit more clear throughout this book. It's a good question. Okay, Bob, you want to pick up here and when they all saw? You got to unmute. Bob, you got to unmute. There you go.
And when all the men of Israel who were in the valley saw that they had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their towns and fled. The Philistines then came and occupied them.
Okay, and so they're victorious, right? The people of Israel run for their lives because it's not ending well. And the Philistines come and they take over. This gets a little bit gross now, so just be forewarned. Okay, Bob, let's keep going.
The next day, the Philistine came to strip the slain, and they found Saul and his son lying on Mount Gilboa. They stripped him and carried off his head and his armor, and sent them through the land of Philistine to spread the news of their idols and among the people. They placed his armor in the temple of their God, and they impaled his head in the temple of their God.
A little gory, right? A little gory in the story. Sort of what he didn't want, right? Like Saul sort of like really didn't want his body to be desecrated, which is why he wanted sort of the Israelites to finish him off. But the best laid plans of mice and men, even though, he sort of ends his own life, sort of ends his suffering here, the Philistines do find him, and they find his body, and they behead him, and carry around his head on a stick for a bit. And then they sort of put it as a marker in their temple, right? And so, what's the old saying? You lop off a few heads, people complain less. It's some sort of saying like that. Just got to do it once. Bob, give me one more.
Yes, when all Jabesh Gilead heard everything that the Philistine had done to Saul, all the stalwart men set out, who moved the bodies of Saul and his son and brought them to Jabesh. They buried the bones under the oak tree in Jabesh, and they fasted for 7 days.
Okay, and so they
So
sort
that
of
is where
like,
it comes from when somebody dies, the 7 days, right?
yeah. So like here they do a little shiva, basically, right? They have a little shiva minyan, beforehand, which is interesting to see. So yeah, the idea here being that they're able to get him back, so to speak, right? Um, they're able to restore him, so to speak, and to bury him properly, right? They sort of had that mission, um, and then that's where they put him. That's where they bury him. I was thinking that where it is, it's towards the south. It's 13 miles southeast of Beit Sha'an, according to my note here. And so they're able to give him again a more proper burial and not just leave him out there for the crows. So. Thank you for that, Bob. Linda White, you want to unmute? Linda, can you hear me?
unmuted. There it goes.
There you go.
Saul died for the trespass that he had committed against the Eternal, and not having fulfilled the command of the Eternal. Moreover, he had consulted a ghost to seek advice, and did not seek advice of the Eternal. So God had him slain, and the kingdom transferred to David, son of Jesse.
Okay, and so this is sort of the addendum here for Saul, that there is a little bit of this sense of if he hadn't screwed up, maybe he'd be okay. Maybe he'd still be ruling, and his line would be ruling. But because he had made numerous mistakes during his reign, including a little necromancy, trying to engage with the spirits of the dead to learn what's going on. For all these things and more, he gets the kingship yanked from him, and it's given to David instead. And so we feel bad for Saul, but we also have this little note that's saying, you know what, he brought this little bit upon himself through his less than righteous actions. Because again, remember who the book's going to be cheering for. David is the superhero in our story, so everyone else can take a little bit of a back seat. Okay, chapter 11. Linda, you want to keep going here?
All Israel gathered to David at Hebron and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. Long before now, even when Saul was king, you were the leader of Israel. And the Eternal your God said to you, you shall shepherd my people Israel. You shall be ruler of my people Israel." All the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and David made a pact with them in Hebron before the Eternal. And they anointed David king over Israel, according to the word of the Eternal through Samuel.
Okay, so yeah, and so now that Saul's out of the way, Saul is out of the picture, it's time for David. And again, they're going to make this very clear in this book. All of Israel gathers to David in the middle of Hebron and basically anoint him king. And say, you're the man. Okay, now it's your turn. But now he's in Hebron. But of course we know that's not where he's going to stay, right? Hebron is nice, but there are other battles in front of him. And David, as we know from just his, the legacy of David, right, is that he's a warrior. And so now the fighting begins, right? Now is when, so the Philistines had their moment in the sun, and now David is going to come a sword in hand, and he is going to start taking over places and start to really expand the kingdom of Israel at this point. Because Hebron was sort of the seat of power for a long time. Hebron today still exists. It is south of Jerusalem. It's in what is now the West Bank, and so it's part of the territories. And so that but this is a little bit of the history. That Hebron is here as well. And David now is going to be on a mission, and the first part of that mission is let's centralize power a little bit. And so where are we going to go? Not Hebron, but Jerusalem, of course. Randall, you want to give us a bit of a read?
David and all Israel set out for Jerusalem. That is Jebus, where the Jebusites inhabitants of the land lived. David was told by the inhabitants of Jebus, "You will never get in here." But David captured the stronghold of Zion. It is now the city of David.
Indeed, right? You're giving a little bit of history. Where Jerusalem wasn't always Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem used to be Jebus, because that was the capital city of the Jebusites, right? And so David is going to go conquer it. And they're saying, nah, you can't get in here. And David said, you know what? Yes, I can. And David comes and knocks them off, takes over the city. And now, it's being written in, it's as well into the future. So they're looking back on it. So they're saying, and now David conquered it. and now it is the city of David, right? You call it a city of David for a reason, because David is the one who took it over. David is the one who conquered it, and eventually, as we're going to read, moves the seat of power to Jerusalem to become the capital city, because that wasn't the case in the very beginning during Saul's reign. And so now it's there. We're going to get a little bit of the fighting here. Randall, you want to keep going?
David said, "Whoever attacks the Jebus first will be the chief officer. Jacob, son of Zariah, attacked first and became the chief. David captured the stronghold, therefore it renamed the city of David. David also fortified the surrounding area from the Millo roundabout, and the Jebba rebuilt the rest of the city."
Thank you for that. And so Joab, or Joab, however I want to say it, Joab sort of becomes David's right-hand man, sort of becomes the general and chief strategist in a way. And so he steps up to the plate, he grabs that brass ring, and sort of becomes David's number two. And they're fighting, they're battling, they're taking over some of the cities, they're creating fortifications. It's what you do when you go into a land and you conquer it, right? You conquer, and then you build up to make sure that it can't be reconquered or taken away from you. And so David and Joab are doing the fighting here, and also the building at the same time. And he keeps going. He's a tough cookie. Sharon, you want to pick up here?
David kept growing stronger, for the Eternal of Hosts was with him. And these were David's chief warriors who strongly supported him in his kingdom together with all Israel to make him king, according to the word of the Eternal concerning Israel.
I like to add this in. I could have edited it out, but I actually like this part only because like you're getting a sense of David's posse. Like David is getting a gang together of military might. And this gives you more detail perhaps than you need to have, but it's fun. Anyway, I think just to almost have this image of, the Davidic rat pack, like sort of his like gang of brothers that he's going to go to war with. And so they're going to get it. Here's a list of the warriors. I didn't give you the whole thing because it would have been ridiculous, but here's just some of the random people that we are going to note here as a part of his contingent. So Sharon, you can give me the next two.
Okay, this is the list of David's warriors. Yashobim, son of Hakmoni, the chief officer, he wielded his spear against 300 and slew them all on one occasion.
Yeah.
Next to him was Eliza, son of Dodo, the Ahohite. He was one of the three warriors. He was with David at Pas Damim when the Philistines gathered there for battle.
Yeah, give me one more.
Sure. There was a plot of ground full of barley there. The troops had fled from the Philistines, but they took their stand in the middle of the plot and defended it, and they routed the Philistines. Thus the Eternal wrought a great victory.
Yes, indeed, right? And so, like, it's basically, these are my mighty men. These are my, what is it? Camelot, right? So, like, this is like King Arthur and Lancelot, right? So, like, this is the crew. He has Jashobim, and he has Eleazar, the dodo bird. All these people, right, are coming in to kick some butt, and they're coming in to take over things. And they're like these legendary warriors. This one killed 300 with a spear, and the other one, fought in the middle of barley. He didn't let the barley get in his way, and he still was able to defeat people, and rout the Philistines. And so it's sort of giving you a sense of these heroic acts. If you're going to tell a good story, you need some heroic acts, right? You need some acts of bravery and courage. Or else what fun is that? This is like political nuance, no one cares. You want to have these like great and bold acts of bravery and courage and of fighting and the victory against all odds. That makes a good story. You would buy that, like you have to create a little mystery, a little aura, a little something here, or else he's just some dude. But you need to sort of have a little bit of oomph, and these stories give a little extra oomph to David. And we get this very weird story afterwards, actually. It's a little bit bizarre. Debbie Siegel, you want to pick up here? David was then.
David was then in the stronghold, and the Philistine garrison was then at Bethlehem. David felt a craving and said, "If only I could get a drink of water from the cistern which is by the gate of Bethlehem." So the three got through the Philistine camp and drew water from the cistern which is by the gate of Bethlehem. And they carried it back to David, but David would not drink it, and he poured it out as a libation to the Eternal.
He's so thirsty. If only I had some water. They go get him water, and he spills it on the floor and makes a little offering to God of water. So what's behind this? Why does he do that? And keep going.
Or he said, "God forbid that I should do this. Can I drink the blood of these men who risked their lives?" For they had brought it at the risk of their lives, and he would not drink it. Such were the exploits of the three warriors.
A little bit of a weird story, but this idea that like he didn't ask them to do it, so they sort of risked their lives for water, and he said, you know what, this is so powerful, I'm just going to, give an offering to God instead because I don't want to profit from these people risking their lives just for a bit of water. But the idea is he has his Robin Hood also comes to mind, like Robin Hood and his merry men, sort of like King David and his mighty men who are coming to help him take over the land. You have to remember, right? David's story, much like Joshua, in the Battle of Jericho, Joshua's story, David's story, these are stories of conquest, right? These are stories of retaking the land they had before. This is about overcoming enemies. And so David's got sword and shield in hand. David's a warrior. David's the one who was already knocked off Goliath, in his younger years. Like David has some stature amongst the people as a fighter, as somebody who is a military expert. And now he, as king, is also like general as well. And he is commanding his forces, right? Going back to the idea of David being this exemplary leader and model citizen. He's now in charge, and he is going to create a campaign, a military campaign, surround himself with the right people to retake the land and to reestablish sovereignty over these different places. Okay, so we have the military part of it, which is great. But now what do you do next, right? After you take over, you have to take over. What has to happen next, right? We need to establish the cult of worship, right? We have to get the sacrificial rites going again. So now that we've had victory in our battles, now the next part is, again, the religion, the ritual. Sandy, you want to pick up here? Then David consulted? Still muted.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
Then David consulted with the officers of the thousands and the hundreds, with every chief officer. David said to the entire assembly of Israel, "If you approve, and if the Eternal our God concurs, let us send far and wide to our remaining kinsmen throughout the territories of Israel, including the priests and the Levites in the towns where they have pasture lands, that they should gather together to us in order to transfer the ark of our God to us. For throughout the day of Saul, we paid no regard to it."
Oh, a little slap to Saul. Poor Saul can't catch a break to save his life, quite literally. But Saul just really here has a problem, at least now according to this tradition. Saul ignored the Ark of the Covenant. Who can ignore the Ark? Right? It's a pretty important thing that we have. Just as Indiana Jones. Like the Ark is very important. Top people in charge of this thing. So, and so we need to have the Ark. And so they're going to go get it out of storage, out of the room that it's in, right? They have to get the Ark out and put it back in its proper place, or create a proper place, for the Ark of the Covenant. So let's get everyone together. Let's assemble the team. We've had the military team. Now let's assemble the religious team, the ritual team. The ritual committee has to come together, right? And has to help us in this act. Let's bring the priests and the Levites together, the singers, everyone. Let's all come together. We got some schlepping to do. It's moving day. Okay, we got to get this ark, somebody get it on wheels, and let's take this out and bring it where it needs to be. That's David's pitch. And what do they say? Yay, David. So Sandy, keep going one more.
The entire assembly agreed to do so. For the proposal pleased all the people. David then assembled all Israel from Shihor of Egypt to Lebo Hamath in order to bring the ark of God from Kiriath Jearim. David and all Israel went up to Baalah, Kiriath Jearim of Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, the eternal, enthroned on the cherubim, to which the name was attached.
Okay, so annoying place names aside, they are getting all their stuff together, and they are about to have a little bit of a road trip, bring the ark to where it needs to be. And so it's different border towns, right? So they're bringing everyone together from the different borders to get more centralized, and they're going to bring the ark to a more centralized location. But now we get to a fun story here as well. Bob, you want to pick up here? They transported. Bob, you got to unmute. There you are.
They transported the ark of God on a new cart from the house of Abinadab. Uzzah and Ahio guided the guards, and David and all Israel danced before God with all their might, with songs, lyres, harps, timbrels, cymbals, and trumpets. But when they came to the threshing floor of Chidon, Uzzah put out his hand to hold the ark of God because the oxen had stumbled. The Eternal was incensed at Uzzah and struck him down, because he laid a hand on the ark, and so he died before God.
Yeah, so we got a problem, right? You got to be careful transporting precious objects. If you ever move somewhere and you have some other dudes carrying your stuff, like, don't you always take a little extra care when, like, that's the box of china, that's the box of knickknacks, that's the box of whatever it is. You got to be fragile. You got to have careful and be careful. And so they're having a little bit of a party, right? You have to almost think of, like, I was going to say Mardi Gras, but I think that's still accurate. But like some sort of like really big, raucous parade, right? It's like a float. They're bringing the Ark of the Covenant, out down the streets. Yay, yippee, noise and celebration as this is happening. But, it's a bumpy road. We don't have pavement yet, right? It's a bumpy road here and there. And around this threshing floor, there's a bump. And maybe the ark starts to teeter a little bit, starts to teeter-totter a little bit. And Uzzah, being one of the dudes here who's helping to guide this cart, wants to steady it, right? Sticks out his hand. And then what happens?
That kind of put a damper on it a little bit of the celebration.
Puts a little damper on it. You got it right. I mean, how are you going to have a party? You got a dead guy now, right? And so God struck him down because he can't touch the ark. He's not allowed. There's a greater conversation here, perhaps, about being careful with the holy, right? Being careful with the sacred, right? Because that's what we're looking at here. You think about our tradition that has come to us today, right? Like, what's the thing when people carrying the Torah they're most afraid to do? Like to drop the Torah, right? Like, you got to be very careful with the scroll, with everything else. The accoutrement, even prayer books. Like, we're supposed to be careful with things that we ascribe, sacredness to, holiness to. So this is an example. A few weeks back, we had the story of Nadav and Avihu, right? Aaron's sons who offer that alien fire to God, and they get struck down. And this is, I think, actually the Haftarah from the Torah portion. A similar story of someone getting struck down for perhaps not being careful enough with the holy. I don't know what the man was supposed to do. I wasn't there. If you see the ark stumbling and bumbling a bit, one would think that would be a good thing to maybe try to stop it from falling down. But in this case, it does cost him his life. And I think it's a warning about the power of the divine. At least his face didn't melt off like in Indiana Jones, right? That would have been worse for those who got that reference. But the idea being that you have to be very careful with the holy. But as Bob, you said, it puts a little bit of damper on the festivities. It's exactly right. So Bob, give me the next paragraph. David was distressed.
David was distressed because the Eternal had burst out against Uzzah, and that place was named Perez Uzzah, as it is still called. David was afraid of God that day. He said, "How can I bring the ark of God here?" So David did not remove the ark to its place in the city of David. Instead, he diverted it to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. The ark of God remained in the house of Obed-Edom in its own abode 3 months. And the Eternal blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all he had.
Okay, so there's a little bit of a concern here, right? David's like, you know what? Maybe transporting this precious cargo, maybe we're going to put a little halt to that for a minute because I'm terrified, because maybe it's not a good sign, a good omen that somebody dies on the journey. And so David says, you know what? Let's take a pause. Let's take a pause for the cause, and let's, put the ark here for now. And let's just put it, let's let Obed Edom, whatever his name is, let's let him have the ark for a little while. And it turns out he has the ark. Hey, great things are happening for good old Obed. His life gets a lot better, which is a sign we're going to see for David going, okay, we just have to be careful with it. The ark isn't cursed. The ark is a source of really good fortune and blessing because Obed does really well for himself.
He was the Gittites, were they weren't Jewish, were they?
So Gittite is yes, they're from one of the different clans at this point. It's not like a Jebusite. Gittite is not. It's part of our group, so to speak. There's so many ites in this book. I mean, it's amazing. There's ites I never heard of, and Gittite being one of them. So they're doing okay though. He's happy to have the ark. Things go well for him. We learn later, he's a Levite, and so he is he's leaving the ark with somebody that it's proper care. He's not just leaving with Joe Schmo Israelite. He's leaving it with a Levite who is in charge of temple service. Okay. We're going to fast forward a little bit. Chapter 14, Linda White. Linda, you want to unmute? There you go.
That is the King Hiram who helped Solomon with the temple, right?
Indeed. It's a little foreshadowing. Yes, indeed. You got that one right, Bob. Yep. Okay, Linda, keep going. King Hiram.
King Hiram of Tyre sent envoys to David with cedar logs, stone masons, and carpenters to build a palace for him. Thus, David knew that the Eternal had established him as king over Israel, and that his kingship was highly exalted for the sake of God's people, Israel.
Yeah, and so it's like a nice gift, when you become president or you become, prime minister, whatever it is nowadays, usually you get the little gifties from your new colleagues, right? You get some nice words of welcome, maybe a little gift, when you travel. And so David's king, and so King Hiram says, you know what, I'm going to get in good with this guy. Let me send him some gift. It's sort of an IKEA kind of gift, it's sort of like you got to build it yourself. But here is the cedar, the stone, and some other things. And he sends people, I guess, as well. So it's a do it yourself, or at least do it with your friends kind of gift. Build a palace, right? You're a king. You can't be living in some hut somewhere. You got to get a nice house. So that David takes that as a sign that God has blessed him in this endeavor, and he's going to build a nice house. And when you have a nice house, you got to fill it up a little bit, right, so to speak. And so, Linda, how does he do that?
He took more wives in
Indeed.
Jerusalem, and David begot more sons and daughters. These are the names of the children born to him in Jerusalem: Shemua, Shobab, Nathan, and Solomon, Ibhar.
You don't have to worry about all these names. Don't worry about it.
And all
A
the
lot of
rest of
names.
them.
The rest of them and the bunch, right? The Brady bunch
Right.
come in. There's a story of a man named David who had lots of wives and concubines. I don't think it goes over as well in the same way. That's the top of my singing voice right now. So the reality is that he's going to be fruitful and multiply. Now, I mentioned, right, remember in the beginning I had mentioned this, and gloss over some of this stuff. There's no mention, right, of Bathsheba, right? There's no mention of that little sordid tale, gazing down at her bathing in the rooftop, and sort of this scene of seduction, and then putting her husband, Uriah, on the front lines of the battle so he'd be killed. And he can marry Bathsheba. Like, that's been excised from all of this. That's not here. Just sort of mentions, hey, he had some wives, had some kids, as you do, and these are their names. Nothing to see here. Nothing, don't pay attention to that. Had some kids, Mazel Tov, send them a gift. Have a little corned beef, maybe a bagel. It's a nice time for everybody. Send a gift. Have a little manischewitz, have a little schnapps, it's fine. A little schlivovitz for everybody. But don't ask too many questions. That's what we have here. So Linda, give me one more.
When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over all Israel, all the Philistines went up in search of David. But David heard of it, and he went out to them.
Yeah, and so basically now it's like when there's instability, when there's transition, the Philistines want to attack. Happens to be true, right? When there's instability, some of the jackals, they like to circle, right? And so there's going to be an attack now. But King David, again, smart cookie, military leader. He's not messing around here. So he's like, you know what? You want to come bother me? Let me get my merry men together, and we're going to meet you out in the field. And we'll see who's standing by the end of it. And so, Randall, you want to give me the next two?
The Philistines came and raised the valley of Raham. David inquired of God, "Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hand?" And the Eternal answered him, "Go up, I will deliver them into your hands." Thereupon David ascended Baalam Perez, and David defeated them there. David said, "God burst out against my enemies by my hands as water bursts out." That is why that place was named Bala Perazim. They abandoned their gods there, and David ordered them to be burned.
Thank you for that. Yeah, so there's a lot of names there and a lot of whatever it is. Just as a completely random note, one of my favorite streets in Jerusalem is the Valley of Rephaim, so to speak. Emek Rephaim is a street in Jerusalem, and I would walk there all the time when I lived, in that neighborhood. And it's a great happening, street. A lot of restaurants, a lot of little places to shop and to eat. Fun place. Complete tangent. But whenever I see the Valley of Rephaim, I imagine nice restaurants and gift shops in Emek Rephaim, the Valley of Rephaim. Not the case at this point, of course. This was literally just the Valley of Rephaim. David says, "Hey, should I go fight them?" "Yeah, go ahead, David. Go ahead. Go in there. Get your hands dirty a bit." And David goes in and David busts them up. Baal Perazim, the bursting, of the enemies as water bursts out. So, David not only kicks some butt, but then he also destroys the idolatry, the temples. He does that as well. Okay. Sharon, you want to pick up here once again? The Philistines.
Once again, the Philistines raided the valley. David inquired of God once more, and God answered, "Do not go up after them, but circle around them and confront them at the balsam trees. And when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, then go out to battle, for God will be going in front of you to attack the Philistine forces." David did as God had commanded him, and they routed the Philistines from Gibeon all the way to Gezer. David became famous throughout the lands, and the Eternal put the fear of him in all the nations.
That's right. So David's kicking some booty this way and that way, right? All the way from here to here, from there to there. And so David is getting known, right? He's getting famous. He's becoming a person of renown. And other people become scared, of David because such was his military might. And it's also good when you have, God as your consigliere. It doesn't hurt either, right? When God's giving the military advice. Let's take a look at 15. Debbie, you want to give me a paragraph or two here?
Wait.
He had houses. You're muted.
Mute. Okay. He had houses made for himself in the city of David, and he prepared a place for the ark of God and pitched a tent for it. Then David gave orders that none but the Levites were to carry the ark of God, for the Eternal had chosen them to carry the ark of the Eternal and to minister to God forever. David assembled all Israel in Jerusalem to bring up the ark of the Eternal to its place, which he had prepared for it.
Yeah, so David creates a space. Once again, it's that dichotomy, right? Once the fighting is over, once there's a little bit of a break of the fighting, now you can focus on the religious aspect of it. You can start getting that going as well. When it's battle time, all hands are on deck, but once that subsides, you can focus on other things. Happens to be true. And so give me one more, then David and the elders.
Then David and the elders of Israel and the officers of the thousands who were going to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Eternal from the house of Obed-Edom were joyful, since God helped the Levites who were carrying the ark of the covenant of the Eternal. They sacrificed 7 bulls and 7 rams.
So good times, right? So now we're back to the joy again. We're bringing the ark. The Levites are doing their jobs. We have the tent set up, like the Mishkan, right? We have the dwelling place set up, and it's going to be great. But we have a very interesting little story here, which is sort of hard to decipher. So David and the Levites, they're all carrying the ark. The singers are singing the songs. David is in his linen best, wearing a linen ephod, sort of looking really stylish in his clean white linen garb. And it's a party, right? All Israel brought up the Ark of the Covenant from the Eternal with shouts and blasts of the horn, trumpets and cymbals, lutes, lyres and harps. And then as the Ark of the Covenant of the Eternal arrived at the city of David, Michal, the daughter of King Saul, who happens to be David's fourth wife. I don't remember how many wives Michal is, but she is there as a wife, but also a daughter of Saul, right? So the line isn't completely gone. Saul does have a daughter, Michal, who is one of the wives. She looks out the window. She wasn't invited to the party, but she looks out the window, so to speak, and saw David having a grand old time, and she didn't love it. She didn't love it. And we don't have a lot more in the story. It just sort of ends there, with Michal looking frowny face at King David. There's some interpretations here that Michal didn't like the idea of David making let's say a spectacle of himself, right? By carrying on in such a way. David, don't dance in public. You're the king. Like it's like you should only maybe you should have a little bit more gravitas, be a little bit more reserved. There's also maybe another part of it that maybe their marriage wasn't the best as it was. After all, she was Saul's daughter, and Saul is dead, and the kingdom is taken away from her family. And maybe it's a marriage of convenience, a marriage of necessity, sort of in a way, to keep the people who love Saul happy that she's part of the kingdom, so to speak.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
where is Goliath? Because of David and Goliath, that was the famous battle.
Well, long dead. He's earlier in the
That is not even mentioned in here.
He was out of the picture a lot earlier in the story. He would be before where we even started, because that was David's sort of like just entrance into the royal court. As him slaying Goliath. So that's the pre-story. That's earlier on in our adventures here. So it's just a sort of weird story about and as we learned in the text, Saul didn't have anything to do with the ark, right? Saul didn't emphasize it. So maybe that's part of her beef as well. It's just an interesting little story, that's sort of a little window into their world that, was David being a little bit too frivolous and a little bit too silly, maybe? Or was he just filled with life and love and with spirit at this moment? And he just had to dance. He had to boogie. He had to, it was Friday Night Live, and he had to grab his tambourine. He wanted to have a good time. And shouldn't we all want to worship God, with joy? So it's just one of those interesting little narratives, in the text. We got a long way to go. There's another, 20 chapters of I think just David. We're going to obviously be a little judicious in some of the reading of it because it is a lot. But I hope it gives you a little bit of insight to sort of like the history they're trying to create. They're trying to build up a King David who is virtuous, who is a war hero, right? He's a war hero. He's a veteran. He loves his mama. He does the right things. He dresses he has a nice dress to him. He's worships God with love. He wants the temple, the worship to be right, and so they're really building up a very idealized King David, right? Michelangelo himself, right? That couldn't make a better David, so to speak. Make sense?
Yeah, it's interesting.
Okay. So it is 8:05, and I'm about to pass out, and so I'm going to depart. It's been a long day, and so with that said, we have a few more weeks to go of Bible study. So looking forward to continuing. We're in the home stretch, but now what we have to do, we have to think about, because once we finish Chronicles, right? Once we finish that up, we got to start planning for next year. We got to see what we want to do, right? Are we back up to the top? Genesis 1:1, or are there other things we want to play with a little bit? Some food for thought.
Yeah.
I got some apocrypha we can look at if we want to really get nuts. So looking at the extra biblical texts, the outside the Bible texts. We got some choices. We got some things to do.
Sounds good.
But first, let's get through David and Solomon and their brood. Okay.
Oh my God.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you,
you all so much.
Rabbi.
We'll catch you on the flip. Okay.